Okay, everybody, welcome to our next chapter in Intro Psych, Chapter 9 on developmental psychology. So without further ado, let's do, and let me pull up my screen. And here we go. All righty. So, Chapter 9 on human development. So when we're talking about human development, we're talking about, we're going to be focusing on the psychological change that occurs across time. Yeah, and there are tons of changes. You can think of change in terms of the physical changes, which we know are plenty during the across lifespan, but we're also going to be focusing a little more on the cognitive as well as the social changes that occur. Yeah, and the area of human development focuses on those particular change, what contributes to those changes, and also recognizes how there is a large degree of universality in these changes across time. Yeah, and what we see in infants, children, adolescents, middle-aged young adults and middle-aged people, and so on. That we see a fair degree of commonality cross-culturally in terms of developmental milestones, achievements, behavioral changes, and things that people can do, yeah, as they get older. So we'll be looking at some of those major ones, yeah, focusing on some of the classic theories in development. And let's proceed. Well, first of all, let's focus on infancy and childhood. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of changes that go on physically. I'm just going to touch on these very quickly. The brain goes through massive development in infancy and childhood. Yeah, with tons of billions of neural interconnections made between the neurons. Yeah, and as an aside, because of these, the significant amount of neuronal interconnections, but also particularly how they're connected, yeah, changes from infancy through childhood. Yeah, and at about age 2, we see a really massive change in how the neuronal network is organized. Yeah, and in part, it's probably related to the development of language that we touched on in chapter 8. Alrighty. And with the advent of language development, yeah, it's about age 2 when we start developing mini sentences, yeah, that kind of telegraphic speech. But then language becomes far more complex. And a lot of our network is based on that, on verbal information. Yeah, and not just verbal, but in part, but with a very large part on verbal information. Yeah. And because of that, right, prior to age 2, for most of us, a lot of our memories and information was stored pre-verbally. Yeah. So because of that, yeah, a lot of time, for most of us, we do not have, it's hard for us to access any memories prior to age 2. Most people honestly can't. Yeah. Now, some people will claim to have had memories of things that occurred during their infancy. Yeah, maybe parents told them something happened during their first year and they can picture it. One, is it possible that some memories have been retained despite this big kind of neurological change at about age 2? Sure, it's possible. And likely that some memories have kind of been retained for some people. There's also a good chance that a lot of that memory is reconstructive in that people told others, individuals, about things that happened when they were infants. And then so the person kind of imagined that and could picture it, right? Because we're very good at imaginers. I don't know if that's a word. Good at picturing things that, so we very well may have constructed those memories and then afterwards thinking we actually had those memories. So it's not super clear, yeah. But the odds are most of us aren't going to remember anything prior to age 2, okay, because of this change. In essence, how the brain is organized and networked. Yeah, we're just dealing with a different, think of it as a different phone, wireless system. We're dealing with another one. This one's not wireless. It is a wire, but here it's a biological wire, right? The neuronal wire. The network is just significantly different. All righty. There are also a lot of physical changes, right? From crawling to rolling to being able to sit unsupported to creeping on all fours and walking. Okay, and that's a huge milestone, which tends to occur at about age 1. Okay, and no small feat. Now, even though it's a 1-year-old doing it, so we probably diminish the importance of walking. That coordinated effort of walking, yeah, is why it is a complex thing that humans have achieved. We do it as a regular thing, and only maybe a couple other species can do it in a very limited way. It took us forever, not forever, but it took us decades. It's only until recently that we figured how to have robots do it because it's hard to reproduce. It's very complex, not only in terms of motorically, it's not uh, that difficult, although that was a challenge too. But actually, it was what was tricky was getting software that could like take into account motion and balance and slight imbalances and offsetting that so that the robot could walk. I mean, now we have robots that can do it, but that didn't happen overnight. That took decades of engineering and computational research to finally achieve because it is a huge milestone. Let's look at cognitive development. And there are a number of theories of how the brain develops, but I want to focus in on a classic theory, which is still referenced, has gone through many revisions since its original uh, um, design, the original framework. But we'll look at the essential framework, which for the most part still holds true. Okay, and the theory we're going to focus in on is the theory proposed by Jean Piaget. Now, here's a picture of Jean Piaget. He was a physiologist, I believe, not a psychologist nor a psychiatrist. But as a good scientist, he was observant. And what he was observant of was his 4 children, and who were all about 2 or 3 years apart. And one thing that he observed as they were growing up was that each child seemed to demonstrate certain cognitive abilities only on or about reaching a certain age. Yeah. And what Piaget laid out was a framework of cognitive development, positing that certain cognitive abilities might only come to the forefront, might only be available or possible, yeah, um, at certain developmental stages, as a function of physical growth, but also its interaction with the environment. Yeah. But that what he was really clear on was the idea that however we develop cognitively is not merely a function of experience or what's going on in the environment. So, for example, you can't speed it up very much. You can a little by maybe a few or several months. Have a child develop certain abilities that they otherwise would not have if you just kind of left them alone or left them in a normal environment where you weren't trying to develop those abilities. But for the most part, it's not going to change. You can't have significant cognitive development occur earlier than when it usually occurs because it is this complex interaction between um, biological, neurological development, as well as its interaction with the environment. Okay. Now, his hypothesis is that humans, right, from infancy and onward through childhood, are like little scientists, always collecting data and testing their hypotheses. All righty, and the testing of the hypotheses goes goes through a process of assimilation and accommodation. Now, what is this? Well, what this refers to is that it refers to the organism, right, the human child, right, interacting with the environment and having certain ideas. But when things happen in the environment that don't fit so neatly into the child's prior ideas, yeah, that they will feel a sense of disequilibrium. Feel a little anxious, like, hey, things aren't making sense. The world isn't making sense. With my ideas. For example, right? Um, a child might not know the difference might when first encountering an animal, typically a dog or a cat, right? Might be a little frightened until the parent provides the idea of a pet or an animal. Yeah, as being distinct. So it's not just a weird looking human being, but that it's separate. It's an animal, it's a pet, right? It's doggy, it's Spot or kitty cat or whatever the case may be, right? So the child has this idea of doggy or kitty cat. you know, and then they have that idea, right? They might first think, wow, what is this weird person? But then they trying to assimilate that idea with their experiences of mom and dad, right? But then accommodating that idea, putting it into a different category, into pet, right? So now it can accommodate that idea by shifting its schema or its map. Yeah, almost you can think of it like programming. All righty. So, but instead of one program, now you've kind of reprogrammed things to have two separate programs, which can now deal with the different information. Okay. And then later, when the child has that idea of doggy, and maybe a couple years later goes on a trip to a farm and sees a piggy, sees a pig, sees a pig, yeah, but the child goes to the fence and goes doggy. I mean, you've seen kids do that all the time, right? They call everything, every animal doggy or catty, kitty. Um, and then and then parent will go, oh no, honey, that's not a doggy, that's a piggy. And the child's like, what? I don't get you. And that's again throwing the child into a little bit of disequilibrium, right? It's thrown off because things aren't jiving with their ideas, right? If they first try to assimilate piggy by calling it a doggy, right? Feels this little imbalance, but then they eventually, right, can accommodate that idea when they get this new construct. They can develop it of a pig or a cow or whatever new animal. Yeah. So that's the idea, that we go through this process of assimilation and accommodation. We try to make it see how the idea fits with what we currently know. And when it doesn't fit, we feel a little off because we don't have the schema or map to lay down this data. But then we can develop constructs or schema that fits into maybe a larger schema or map that can help us understand this new idea. So we have a placeholder for that new idea. All right, well, let's go through Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Yeah? It's one that goes through childhood, from infancy through childhood, and there are four major stages. Okay? Now, the first stage is referred to as the sensory motor stage, and it lasts from about infancy through about the first 2 years of life. Okay? And it's called sensory motor because most of the cognitive processing, most of our thoughts, most of our ideation, yeah, is in the nature of what we sense and how we can move around our environment. Okay, sensory motor. Okay, and that's how most of our thinking is processed via our senses. Yeah, I mean, a lot of our thinking is still through our senses when we read or see visual information, but also a lot of it is based on not just limited to that, but to abstract categories, which we'll get into in a moment. Yeah, but we experience the world through our senses and through our motor movement, what we can touch, when we walk or crawl towards something. Now, in each stage, there are certain cognitive abilities or milestones. Yeah, so we'll talk about each at each of the four stages. In this stage, the one milestone which the child learns is object permanence. And what is that notion? Well, like the term suggests, yeah, or indicates, it's the idea that things exist even when we don't see them. And it's something we take for granted, right? We know a lot of things exist even when we're not seeing them. But for the child in the sensory motor stage, in the early stage of this, yeah, for several months, what they see is what exists. Yeah. One clear example of this is the old peekaboo game you may have played with an infant in your family or your own infant. And you know what that game's about, right? The child's in front of you, and then, you hold up like a cloth or something that covers your face, right? So they can't see past the cloth. It's like a big curtain as far as they're concerned. And then you drop it and you go peekaboo, like, there you were. And it surprises them, right? You put it up in there. And then if you could see them from their side, they're like, hey, what happened? Where'd you go? And then you drop and you go peekaboo. And then they usually giggle and shout out in glee because they see you, right? Because it's really true for the child who does not have object permanence, which is usually the case in the first several months of life. What they see exists and what they don't see don't exist, right? So you kind of come in and out, so to speak. But you notice that then after about several months of age and playing this game a few times, right, they get tired of the game. And some of them will like grab at the cloth and they know you're there, right? They might even grab it knowing that you're back there and start laughing or something. And there, you know, the child's achieved object permanence. Yeah, because they're not fooled or tricked by that game anymore. Yeah. The other thing that occurs at about age 1 through age 2 is the experience of stranger anxiety. Okay. Now, when a child is first born and is an infant, for most of that period, yeah, you can pass the child from one parent to the other, right, for feeding, and from one family member to another. You can pass the little bundle of joy to a neighbor, to a friend to carry, and you're not going to hear much of a peep. Yeah, because in that first several months, you know, humans are kind of like pea pods. You just gotta kind of like water it and, you know, take care of it. And it's pretty happy as a client. It'll cry out if a pea pod can actually cry out, to be fed or because it's tired or cold or what have you. And then if you attend to it, it quiets, right? Well, at about several months, at about between 1 and 2, right, the child starts noticing a difference between parents and family, like brothers and sisters, versus non-family. Yeah, and if you try to pass that 1-year-old now to a person that they're not familiar with, they get very anxious. Yeah, and for some it's pretty intense. They'll really start like uh, making really hollering and screaming and stuff, you know, and that usually passes after a few several months, but never completely, right? Because for little children, right, it's kind of ingrained into them. First of all, that biological ability to notice a difference between different types of people. Yeah, who's family and who's not. That's an important notion to have. That was an important one to evolve with over, you know, generations. Yeah, that ability to distinguish between who was a member of your tribe and who wasn't. Yeah, who was a member of your family and who wasn't. Yeah, and if you couldn't tell the difference and you kept on wandering into other tribes or walking off with, you know, strangers, right? Odds are you didn't survive back in the day. Um, and you might not now if you walk away with the wrong person, right? So that's an ability that doesn't really develop until about 1 or 2, but that's still fairly early on. Yeah, you don't have a whole lot of complex language development, right? Still very basic sentences, a lot of grammar that's incorrect, but man, children can tell who they know and who they don't know. The second stage is the pre-operational, and it occurs between ages 2 and 6. Now it's referred to as pre-operational because it's pre or before formal operations of logical reasoning. Okay, so it's right before then. So it's a form of reasoning, but not excuse me, not the kind of logical operations which we'll get into in the third and fourth stage. Okay, so in the pre-operational stage, from age 2 to 6, and 6 is like into first grade, right? What kids can do cognitively is represent things with the language, right? And that's huge, right? That ability to use words, recognize words, right? By first grade, they're already doing some basic reading and associating the words they say, the words they see and write with ideas, that these are symbols of other ideas, making those connections. Yeah. Now, what are the economic cognitive milestones that occur during this period? Okay, the two big ones are egocentrism and theory of mind. Now, egocentrism is the ability, well, egocentrism is characterized by viewing the world only from one's perspective. Yeah. So, for example, in the picture that you see below, okay, let's see, where's the, okay, let me try to get out of this for a moment. And I'll get right back in. Okay, so like in this picture, we see an infant, probably a year old, then we see a child that's maybe 5 or 6. Yeah. And here they see a model, right? So the child, this infant, sees 2 hills blocking this hill, and behind that hill are 2 cows. Now, this child, this infant, yeah, will experience things, right, from the egocentric view, right? So to them, if they can't see any cows, there are no cows. Alrighty, because from their view, whatever they see, that's reality. Uh, and even if this child were to say, hey, there are two cows from where I'm sitting behind the hills, this child won't be able to appreciate that or understand what's being said. Because again, their view is the view, right? Whereas this child, right, um, understands that the infant can't see the cows, right? That the cows are blocked by this hill and then that hill, right? So we'll understand that their view, right, of the two cows won't be shared by the infant, won't be shared by anybody else who's sitting by here, who can't see it, because their view is different from whoever's sitting here. Yeah, and so this child does not have egocentrism, right? They've gone beyond that. Yeah. Another classic example you may have encountered in your family with your own child or younger sibling. Yeah, it's someone like, it's a situation like if you're watching television, right? So you're watching a big screen TV, you're about 6 feet away, and then you have a 4-year-old child like stand right in front of you, right, watching TV, right? Maybe they're 4 feet away from the screen, and you got to say to them, I can't see through you. And they turn around like, what? uh, you might think they're being lazy or they're being, jerks or something. They can't help it, right? Because they don't, they're in that egocentric perspective of reality, where if they can see it, it's like, why can't you see it, right? But give the kid a couple more years and they understand that they can't stand in front of someone, yeah, because they're blocking your view and now you have no view of the screen. Alrighty. Related to that is this notion of theory of mind. Okay, so what is theory of mind? Okay, theory of mind is the idea that, is the idea that you understand that other people not only have their different own physical vision, physical view, like what they can see with their eyeballs, which is different from yours, but that they have their own interests, desires, wishes, experiences. Yeah. So just because you like cookies doesn't mean the other person likes cookies. Who doesn't like cookies? That is hard to understand. um, but so a child, right, early in the pre-operational stage, age 2 to 4, might not understand why someone else doesn't like the same foods they like, or the same things, and so on, right? But when they get about 5 or 6, they start appreciating that, um, and like appreciating that in particular, the idea that um, they know something that the other person doesn't know. Okay. And that's huge, right? That's a huge accomplishment. We take it for granted, the idea that we know things that other people don't. But to the child early in the pre-operational stage, they don't realize that. Yeah, they think that whatever they've experienced and know, even though you might not have been in the room at the time. Yeah, so let's say something happens like um, uh, they're in a room, right? And then the dog and cat start running around rambunctiously, and they knock over the cookie jar and it falls down, right? And then mom comes around the corner, right? Little boy, little girl expects mom to know that it was the dog or cat, right? Because they saw it. But so they think if they saw it, mom saw it, right? It's as if mom is all knowing, but it's not just mom, it's anybody. Yeah, because whatever you experience, you think others have the same mind or same experience. Again, it's hard to imagine thinking that way, but we did. But if you think about it, if you've had young children, you can kind of understand how they think that way. But until maybe about 5 or 6, do children kind of learn, hey, if people didn't see things or experience things, they have their own mind and they won't know, what I experienced. Okay, so that's theory of mind. That's a huge one. Let's see. And by the way, a theory of mind is actually that development of that ability is something that's been implicated in the development of autism. Yeah, that for a number of those who suffer from autism, one of the things that they often have a difficulty appreciating, is are others' perspectives. Yeah, because in part, because it's related to this idea theory of mind, and for many of those suffering from autism, many of them have difficulty developing this notion. Yeah, why that's the case is not entirely clear, but that seems to be the case. And it actually takes different training to help the autistic child come to appreciate that somebody has different experiences than they. Okay, now we're in the third cognitive developmental stage, that of concrete operations. So now we're getting operational logical reasoning going on here. And this stage is between ages 7 through 11. All righty. The big but here is that the logical operational thoughts are focused on concrete concepts. Now, what's meant by concrete? Yeah, well, you've probably heard the terms before. Yeah, concrete versus abstract thinking. Yeah, what's the difference? Okay, the key difference really comes down to this feature that concrete concepts or thinking is dependent upon the physical features of the idea. Yeah, whereas abstract reasoning is not dependent on the physical features of the construct. Okay. Ooh, well, what do you mean by that, Tsushima? Well, this is what I mean. Okay, so concrete thinking is related to physical characteristics like how something appears or the number of items or its weight, things of that sort. So what would be an example? An example would be, you know, a child being able to talk about about God, but when talking about God, we'll talk about God like as an old man with a white beard up in the sky, right? Those are all concrete notions, right? Old man, a beard up in the sky. All righty. Whereas maybe, right, not maybe, but whereas abstract reasoning isn't dependent on that, right? So someone who's thinking abstractly about God, when asked about what God is, the person might say God is a spirit that exists in everything. It's, you know, it's in God's in us, and so on, things of that sort, right? So it's not analogizing or speaking about God as a man or an old man or a man with white beard and so on. Yeah, kind of like Santa Claus. Um, so that's the distinction between concrete and operational thinking. And from 7 to 11, thinking is still fairly concrete. Yeah. So a lot of children's thinking, they'll do a lot of logical reasoning that they never did before. Yeah. And about a lot of important things such as categories and math and geography and so on. But the thinking about those ideas will be concrete in nature, not abstract. Yeah, they won't be talking about things such as freedom, equity, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and existential issues, because they just can't think that way. Yeah, it's elusive to talk about things that you can't see, touch, weigh, count, and so on. Alrighty. Now, what are the developmental milestones here? Yeah, well, a big one is the idea of conservation. Yeah, and what is conservation? Conservation is the idea that an object, yeah. Now we know many objects have more than one physical characteristic, and we know that if one characteristic of an object changes, it doesn't completely change the object, right? Yeah, I mean, it may alter the object in with 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 respect to that one characteristic, but that other characteristics are still intact. Yeah. So, for example, let's look at an example here. So, if you got two containers of water, yeah, and you got equal mass or equal amount in each, yeah, let's say a liter here, a liter here, and then you leave one of them, this liter here, but you take the other liter and you put it into a flat, wider kind of container, right? A child who has not developed the idea of conservation might be inclined to say that in this instance, right, there's equal amounts of water, but now there's more water here. And why is there more water? Because it's spread out across more of an surface area of the table. Yeah. Now you know it's the same amount of water. It's just the only characteristic that changed is that instead of the width and the height being the same, right? The height is less and the width is wider. It's spread out more, right? But you know it's still the same mass. It's still the same amount, right? So that's the idea of conservation, right? Knowing that even though one characteristic changed of an item or an object, that other characteristics may still be intact, okay? And that's the idea here. Like here's another characteristic. Let's say there are 10 coins and row five, two rows of five. And the first row, um, it looks exactly like the same as the second. Yeah. And like the water, you just spread out the coins, right? You're not, but to a concrete operational child, they may see this as more coins, yeah, or more stuff. All righty. Why? Because it's wider, spread out, and that is one change in row two. Yeah, but we know it doesn't mean it's more coins. Yeah, we know it's the exact same amount, right? Because it's just that one feature, right? It's a width, right? Of all the row, the width of the row has changed, but not the row itself. So that's the notion of conservation. Another and related to this, yeah, um, is the development and understanding of rules and how rules apply. And one great example of how this is developed is through play. Actually, play in school games. Yeah, and I won't get into it now, but when we meet to discuss these matters, this is something we'll get back to. Okay, finally, formal operational thought. Now, formal operations is kind of the big honcho, okay, of thinking. This is where we can think logically, but not only of concrete concepts, but also abstract concepts. Yeah, we could do abstract reasoning. So, for example, you can present um, a kind of moral dilemma or situation to a child, regarding, let's just say, a fact pattern. This has been used in studies on moral reasoning. If you present a fact pattern to a child that, a man's wife was sick with a terminal condition, but she could be saved if she could get the medication, but she can't get the medication, which because she can't afford it. So the man late at night breaks into the pharmacy, steals the drug for his wife to save her life. Alrighty. Now, concrete operational thinking, right? A child in that on that level of logical thinking might be inclined to say, when asked later, is the man wrong? Did he do a bad thing? Right? Maybe more inclined to say the man did a bad thing, because on the concrete operational level, right? If you do a bad act, right, you'll get punished. The police will grab you and put you into jail, right? You'll get punished, just like a spanking, so to speak. Okay. And when you're at the concrete operational level, you're more inclined to think along those lines, like rewards and punishments, right? They're very concrete in nature, right? You do this, this will happen to you. Now, a child can develop abstract reasoning and notions about good and bad, and notions of justice and justification. Might conclude that even though technically this was an illegal act, yeah, because it is an illegal act, right? That the man did a good thing because he was trying to save not only human life, but life of a loved one. Yeah, so he was actually not a bad man, but he was doing a good thing. Alrighty, because notions of justice and justification and innocence are abstract, right? They're not things you can readily count or weigh or see, but they're abstract in nature. So someone at the formal operational stage might reason that way. Okay, so that's Piaget's theory. I'm going to kind of move away, kind of bypass this. And let's talk about adolescence. Okay, there are certainly a lot of physical changes with adolescence. Gonna kind of go past that, and certainly a lot of cognitive changes. But I'm going to focus in when talking about the psychological changes. I want to kind of turn to Erik Erikson's theory of social development, and this is going to take us actually through childhood, through adolescence, and into adulthood and being an elder. But with that, I'm just going to stop for a moment and let's just pause here. Okay, everybody. Hi. Thanks for your patience. Let us return to our discussion. And with that, Alrighty, let's talk about Erik Erikson's theory of social development. Yeah, which is an attempt to, which is a theoretical framework to explain psychological development across the lifespan, from infancy, from when we're born to when we die. Yeah. Um, so Erik Erikson, that's a picture of Erikson right there. Interesting enough, never got his PhD in psychology. I think he got his master's in psychology. I could be wrong, but I don't think even that. I think he was just very well educated, very well read, and developed this theory of personality, of development across the lifespan. Now, what his theory posited was that at different stages, and he came up with about 8 stages across the lifespan, people encounter certain crises or challenges, yeah, at each stage of life. And you can see these crises or challenges were of a cognitive, psychological, social nature. And these, depending on how we dealt with the particular challenge, yeah, we would take one of two paths. Yeah, you can kind of see it as a, excuse me, that at each challenge there'd be a fork in the road, right? If we made a productive choice, it'd be a positive path to psychological growth, and if not, we would be kind of stilted in our psychological growth. Yeah, result leading to possible negative consequences. Now, with that said, Erickson was also of the thinking that any decisions or paths taken weren't final, and that we could always make better decisions and go down a better path down later in to the lifespan. Okay, so it's whatever excuse me, paths we take, it's not written in stone. Alrighty. But also, whenever we do make a good choice or better choice, and we go down a path that's more productive, it increases the probability of a positive resolution with the next challenge. Alrighty. Another aspect of his personality, it was a developmental theory, but it could also be construed as a personality theory. His theory of personality development really took into incorporated the impact of society. Yeah, that a lot of these challenges are a function of how we need to relate with the grade, with whatever our milieu is, and our milieu or environment is going to be different depending on what stage of life we're at. Okay, so Erickson proposed 8 stages. Yeah, the first of the 8 is the oral sensory, and it's from birth to the first year, and it kind of harkens to Piaget's theory, right? The sensory motor stage, in that the way we relate to the world is through the mouth, right? Through feeding, um, and because for the infant, right, it's about eating and sleeping, basically, and also the sensory functions, right? What we see and hear, and taking in the world that way. Now, at this stage, with the fork in the road that the child um, is challenged with is whether they're going to experience the world as something that they can basically trust, or whether there will be mistrust. Yeah, and how may that develop? Well, that's going to develop in large part as a function of the environment. Yeah, is it um, consistent, predictable, fairly constant? Yeah, and this certainly can be affected through things like feeding and being nurtured by constant, consistent parenting. Alrighty. If given that kind of environment, the child is more likely to develop basic trust. Yeah, and that basic trust essentially meaning that they experience the world as predictable. Yeah, that if they act upon it, like crying for food, that the world will respond. Yeah, and so on. Versus an experience of the world as or parenting that's unpredictable, inconsistent, yeah, such that the child kind of develops this attitude or belief that even if they cry for help, the world is unpredictable. They don't know if they're going to get a response back. Okay. Now, if they can develop basic trust, the personality or ego strength that develops is one of hope. Yeah, because if the world is predictable and consistent, right, you will be optimistic and you will see a positive outcome down the road. You'll be able to be hopeful. The next stage is the muscular anal, okay, and that lasts between ages 2 and 3. And it's muscular referring to the development of motor movement like walking and grabbing and touching things and so on, be it people or objects. And it's also referred to as anal because during this stage, yeah, the child learns to control its feces, right? It's the child is toilet trained. And this isn't just relating to a Freudian notion of toilet training. It really relates to this notion about being able to relate with society. Yeah, because society, civilization says that the infant, right, for the most part, right, for about a year in their lives, might poop their pants, and someone else will clean it for them. Right? They're treated like little kings and queens. They can poop their pants, and someone will treat it, right? We'll wipe their behind and clean them. But that's not life, right? People are going to do that much longer beyond the first year of life. And what's going to happen, right, as the child gets into about 2 or 3, is helping train the training of the child to to control their feces, to use the toilet, right, via toilet training. Now, if the child is properly toilet trained through consistent, patient, understanding parenting, what the path they'll probably take is one of autonomy. Yeah, that they can do things themselves, like go to the toilet by themselves. Yeah, whereas if they're toilet trained via impatient, inconsistent, um, emotionally erratic, right, punishing parenting, that they're more likely to develop a sense of shame and doubt about their abilities to act autonomously. All right, and just like with the first stage, if they can go down a positive path, the personality or ego strength that will be developed is one of will. Yeah, that they can exert a will or force or control over themselves to proceed further. Let's just pause for a moment here and continue. Alrighty, moving right along. The third stage, the locomotor genital, occurs between 4 to 5 years. Here, some of the milestones or the challenge before the child is initiative versus guilt. Now, the reason why this is a path is because what develops around this period, right, is increased locomotor control, the ability to move about their environment, and so on. One of the things you may recall, if you've had children or in younger siblings or family members, are children about 4 to 5 really doing a lot of things physically which they shouldn't be doing, right? Climbing on bookshelves, trying to lift suitcases which they can't carry at the airport. But that's what children do, right? They're experimenting with these new strengths and abilities which they couldn't when they were 1 or 2. But now that they're about 4 to 5, right, they're walking about. Their walking is much more improved, so that they can. And that's why we see children just dash out, right? When you're walking with them in public, it's because they love using that power. Right now, as an adult, it's like, ugh, I'm in no mood to run. But man, when you're 4 to 5, you're always in the mood to run because it's like getting a motorcycle or something, right? Your legs are like a motorcycle. Well, during that period, right, the child has to learn when and how to use those skills, right? That they shouldn't be climbing bookshelves when mom and dad isn't around. They shouldn't be darting into the street. That they can dart and do that, like if they're on the playground or on a grassy field and so on, right? They can climb the jungle gym and all that kind of stuff. All righty. So when and how and so on, and how to do it in a safe way. Yeah, and often children have to learn also just by negative consequences, right? By falling from the bookshelf, or being kind of scolded when they dart into the street. So that now again, if they are in an environment where they can do that and do it through patient, consistent, and consistent with consequences, parenting, yeah, they can develop a sense of initiative, a sense of ability to know when to move in the world and take progressive steps in how to do that, versus feeling guilty, feeling like they're always wrong or that they're going to make a mistake. Yeah, or if they do something, it's invariably going to lead to something punishing. Yeah. Now, during this stage, about 4 to 5, Erickson posited that there's also a lot of gender identity development. Yeah, so it kind of goes hand in hand with that kind of motoric development. Yeah, so how do you act motorically as a male or female in one's culture? Yeah, and there's and you know, rightly or wrongly, little boys and little girls still in many cultures are taught to move or act or respond in a certain way, which is gender driven by gender norms. Yeah. Um, so for Erickson, a lot of gender development may occur during this phase. And it's referred to the Oedipal phase, not that he saw it as Oedipal development pursuant to Freud's theory, which we'll get into at a later chapter, but with the idea that ideas of how to be a boy or girl, how to act on the world as a boy or girl develops around this time. The fourth stage is the stage of latency, kind of the quiet period, which even Freud had. Yeah, for Erickson, this quiet period, much like with Freud's notion, refers to the period of education for the 6-year-old until they become a pre-adolescent. Yeah, so 6 to 12. And during this stage, right, the environment is different now. Okay, the environment is the environment of the classroom. Previously, it was the environment of the home and parents. Yeah. Um, but now the environment is different, and those who have impact on them are different individuals. One is the teacher, but probably even more so are those um, fellow students, right, in the classroom who are about the same age as they. Right? Because prior to school age, the period in their lives where they're surrounded by classmates, yeah, the child usually was the youngest creature around, right? Because it was either their parents or older siblings, right? Maybe later they may have had a younger sibling if they were about 4 or 5, but there was nobody their age unless they were twins or triplets or something, which is rare, but happens. But the majority of children, right, are single births, so they're the only ones who are at their age and size and mental capacity. But now in school, they're surrounded by anywhere between 15 or 30 others who are about the same size, mental ability, and so on as they are. Yeah? So a big psychological milestone here is ability to work with others, to demonstrate what one can do, but also what comes into place competition. How does one compare to others? And then finding out what their strengths and weaknesses are. Yeah. So if they're in an environment, where that exploration is supported and nurtured, they can develop a sense of industry. Yeah, in terms of their ability to build and learn and acquire information, acquire knowledge, and acquire skills. Or are they going to develop a sense of inferiority? Yeah, being focused in on when they make mistakes or what they can or can't, or maybe more appropriately, can't do. As opposed to focusing on what they can do, or if they do have weaknesses, how to work on those weaknesses. Now, if they take the path of industry, they're more likely to develop the personality or ego strength of competence. The idea that they can learn certain things and be good at something. And this is something that child will experience for really in a substantial way for the first time between ages 6 and 12, which is like 2nd grade to 6th grade, something like that. Now, the 5th stage is that of adolescence, and that occurs between 13 and 19. And the path fork in the road here is identity versus role confusion. Alrighty, can one develop a sense of who they are, what they value, what they know, what they may want to pursue as an occupation, or what kind of work they want to pursue versus confusion. What are their values, who are they, and so on. Yeah, if they can take the positive path, they can develop the ego strength of fidelity. Yeah, and that's the ability to sustain, some kind of connection or loyalty to certain ideas, philosophies, um, mental kind of orientations, and so on. Yeah, and also deal with the possible contradictions that occur in any kind of position one takes, or um, either morally or socially, and so on, and make sense of those contradictions, because there are always, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, there'll be contradictions. Yeah, if you're Christian or Buddhist, there are contradictions within those. Yeah, anything complex is going to have contradictions. So the ability to still be a Christian, still be a Republican, or musician, or whatever the case may be, and making sense of the inevitable contradictions that occur, because life is complex with contradictions. Yeah, it's not, in most cases, it's not absolutely good or absolutely bad. Um, and we'll talk about some of the ways adolescents can develop this sense of identity when we meet and have our discussions about this chapter. Now, the next stage is stage 6, between ages 20 and 24, the stage which most of you are in right now, okay? And the fork in the road is intimacy versus isolation. Yeah, so intimacy may be by way of romantic intimacy, right? Finding that partner, and maybe living together, or maybe getting married, or just intimacy in terms of friendships, yeah, or working with a group of people. Alrighty. Versus isolating oneself at the workplace, or from friends, or having difficulty finding someone with whom that they can be intimate with, yeah, and be themselves with. The fork in the road, and if they are able to go down the path of intimacy, the ego strength is one of the capacity to love. The seventh stage is that of middle adulthood, which is kind of where I'm at right now, which is between 25 and 64 years. So I'm getting onto the latter point of middle adulthood, more like late adulthood, getting to late adulthood for myself, being 54. The fork in the road here is generativity versus stagnation. Now, do you feel that you're in a position where you're contributing to, again, society, right? So one's relationship with society, and or is one in a position where, they still haven't quite found what they want to do or how they want to contribute, and feeling stagnant. You know? If the former, the ego strength that can develop is one of care. Yeah, care for the community, for younger people and others. Yeah, if they're married with children, then their family or their spouse, and so on. And finally, the final stage is late adulthood, which occurs between 65 and death. And the fork in the road is ego integrity versus despair. Yeah, and for here, what's meant by ego integrity is the notion of whether a person is able to integrate or pull together, yeah, kind of make sense of their lives up to that point. Yeah, whatever past decisions, choices they've made, they kind of pull it, have it all come together, or pull it all together in a way that makes sense, that gives them existential meaning. Yeah, or someone at a point where, because of relationships have been disconnected, or they haven't really been able to find what they wanted to do, is there the experience of despair? Yeah, that they've gone through this life. They're getting into late adulthood, and they're having difficulty uh, grasping a sense of meaning about their existence, about why they're here. Okay? If the former, the individual may be able to develop a sense of wisdom, yeah, and which is different, right, from intelligence and so on, right? Intelligence we think of in terms of problem solving, and being able to learn from one's mistakes and all that kind of stuff. Wisdom, yeah, certainly incorporates aspects of those things, but it's the idea that you develop a kind of an understanding or appreciation of how things work. Yeah, and wisdom is often thought of as the kind of knowledge or thinking style that you only derive with time. Yeah, it isn't something you can crack open a book and go, well, now I'm wise. Yeah, it's something from personal experience. Yeah, experience, not just intellectual, but interpersonal, emotional, spiritual, all that kind of good stuff. And with that, that's all I have to say about Erickson's theory as it applies from infancy through death. And with that, that's all I have to say about chapter 9. Okay. And with that, again, as usual, thank you for the privilege of your attention. And with that, I will see you guys the next time we cover a chapter in intro psych. All right, guys, have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.